Our next session is a bit of a bonus today before we break for lunch. I'm very privileged to introduce Alan Sutherland, Chief Executive of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. Alan has been Chief Executive of WICS since its establishment in 2005. He was previously Water Industry Commissioner and was responsible for the merger of the three waters authorities in 2002 that were in place in Scotland at that time. This change paved the way for the substantial improvements in efficiency and service that have since been delivered by Scottish Water. Alan also worked with the Scottish Government to develop the regulatory framework, ensuring that each party had clear responsibilities and clarifying the regulator's role as decision maker. Can we please welcome Alan to the stage?
Good afternoon, or is it still morning? Yes, morning, I've got three things I think I want to say to you. The first is you, like us in Scotland, have got a huge, huge challenge ahead of you. The second is whether you like it or not, you're going to pay for it. And your only real decision is when you're going to pay for it, or maybe whether you let it be paid for by your kids or your grandkids or your great-grandkids, but you're going to pay for it. And the third thing I'm going to say to you is don't delay in getting on with it, because the longer you delay, the worse it gets and the more painful it gets. Okay? So if I start with the first of those, on a rainy day, 1st of November 1999, a minister, Sarah Boyack, handed me a document that said, here are the investment needs we have in Scotland for the water industry. Right? What I knew about the water industry at that time, you could probably have written on the back of half a postage stamp. Right? I was an economist, I didn't know anything about the water industry, not really. And the answer was, it's £1 billion. Right? All right, that was 1999, there's been a lot of inflation, right? But as of now, right, we've spent 15 billion, not 1 billion, right? And when I look at the investment we need, we're spending on the average about 750, 800 million pounds a year, right? And that's having halved our capital unit costs over the last 25 years, right? I reckon we need to be spending something around 1.7, 1.8 billion pounds a year for the industry in Scotland to be sustainable and for it to be meeting all the targets that are in place and are pretty generally agreed to be essential. So we've been at this 23 years. We've had a lot of investment, but we're really only just getting started, right? And the difficulty is that to invest that amount extra, we are going to be looking at telling citizens that they need to be paying around 2% above the rate of inflation every year for the next 20 years to get to that sustainable level of investment. Now, during the cost of living crisis, you can imagine what the average politician thinks of that. There are quite a few in my regular correspondence, shall we say, on the subject. But you don't really have a choice, right? You're going to pay for it. I'll come to that in a minute. So let's look at New Zealand now, right? You've probably heard this number that we generated, 185 billion pounds of investment being required in New Zealand by around 2050. And people said, well, how can you possibly know? Where did that number come from? Do you know what? It was just a big giant mirror, right? Because it just reflected back what councils had told us. That's all that number is, right? So councils told us what their asset values were. Legally, you've got to have them audited every 3 years, as I understand it, right? They told us what their asset lives were. Now, when we looked at the asset values, we went, that's really low. Why is it so much lower than Australia? Why is it so much lower than the UK? But we just accepted that that nice number that the councils gave us was right. And then we looked at the asset lives And you know what? The asset lives are much longer, according to councils, than they are in the UK and they are in Australia. You've got a small matter of sort of earthquakes and things down here, as I understand it, right? So why have you got longer asset lives than Australia and the UK? But you have, right? So then what did we do? Well, we then did a simple bit of calculation, right? So we took the average lives and we took the asset lives and asset values, right? And worked out, all right, on the average, how much do you need to spend? Now, we're not saying you need to spend that every year, but we're saying you actually need to spend that on average each year. So if you look at it out over a 30 or 40-year period, you can be pretty certain that you need to be somewhere close to that average, right? You might be a bit above, you might be a bit below, right? That accounts for more than half of that 185 billion. So then there was a bit of growth, right? So we took what council said was the growth in population. We took what New Zealand stats say is the average number of people per household. And we calculated, therefore, a number of new connections that were required. Right. Now, in the UK, it's pretty standard and taken to be that each new marginal connection will be more expensive than the last marginal connection that you made, right? In the economic jargon, we say the long-run marginal cost is higher than the average cost. But we didn't do that, right? We just said, you're going to do it for the same price as you do at the moment. And that generated another bit of number. And then the third aspect of this 185 billion was simply saying, well, there's different ways you could look at how much you might need to spend to improve water quality, improve environment. And you can do all sorts of clever models, which I like to think we did, right? Comparing coastlines and densities and river flows and all that sort of good stuff. We did those compared to Scotland, and we did those compared to the UK, did those compared to UK and Europe. But then we also did a very simple calculation, which is say, well, let's just imagine that the average asset value in New Zealand has to be roughly the same as the average asset value per head of population in the UK. So 3 different ways, right? And that's how we got to the enhancement side of the equation. So 185 billion. Bad news for you. That was in 2018-19 prices, right? There's been over 20% capital inflation in New Zealand since then. So get 185 billion out of your heads once and for all, right? Because you're at 220 billion and counting. That's why I'm saying you can't afford to delay, right? You have to start getting on with it. You have to be investing. So let's then go to the question about who's paying, right? I hear lots of stuff, and politicians at home love this, right? We're going to borrow money in order to solve this problem. That's very nice of them to spend your kids' money, right? Because that's what borrowing does. Now, borrowing is really important to help you move revenues gradually over time, to phase in capital programs, to act as oil in the machine, right? I'm not against borrowing, far from it, right? But borrowing doesn't pay for things. There's a difference between funding, which comes from your taxes or comes from your water charges, and financing, right? The nasty thing about lenders of money is they want it back, and with interest, right? So yes, borrow, but don't think it's solving your problem. Now, just to give you a little simple thought experiment, right? To deliver exactly the same capital program between now and 2050, and if I do it such that, this is a bit techie, but excuse me, right? If I do it and I say I'm going to hold my borrowing at an 8% funds flow to debt ratio, right? That means I borrow more, okay? And I keep doing that all the way to 2050, delivering the capital program. Or I do it with 10%, so I'm borrowing less. I hold it at 10% all the way to 2050. Or I hold it at 12% all the way to 2050. Now, what's the difference, right? If I do 8%, you pay a lot less now. And those of you who are still paying bills in 2050 are going to be paying a lot more. That's what happens. Right? Because all you've done is money that could and should have been paid for by the current generation for the service they're receiving is now going to be paid for by that future generation. Right? So actually, it just shows financing is financing, right? It's useful, but it doesn't solve your problem. So you are going to pay, right? Of course, if you don't actually want to pay more, you can pay in another way, right? You can pay with a lack of resilience in your services. You can pay with not as good a service as you want, not as nice an environment as you want, a lack of ability to adapt to climate change. Those are your choices, right? Now, my third leg, don't delay. So we heard a lot about sewer overflows in the UK. I think it was a dreadful decision by Water UK to apologise on behalf of the industry. I'm a regulator, right? I should love the fact that Water UK apologised, because Water UK apologising says to the regulator, do you know what? We took all the money for maintenance that you gave us. We didn't complain about it at the time. We've got a problem. So as a regulator, I say, shareholder problem. Nothing to do with the customer. So I should love that. Except that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was there was a structural underfunding, as you've heard, of maintenance. A structural underfunding. We were spending a fraction of what we should have been spending on maintaining. And we took our eye off the ball, which maybe there should be a bit of an apology for, about the amount of extra rainwater that was going into the sewers, and the consequence is scandal. Right? So if you're not funded to do something, why are you apologising? Now, in my view, right, evil regulator back on, there's lots of things that the company should apologise for. Levels of dividends, senior level salaries. I could go on and on about all the sins of water companies, right? But not maintaining something when you've not been funded to maintain it is not something you should apologise for. So that's why I don't think the apology was a good idea. But there's a real lesson, right? It is very easy in a long-term industry to under-maintain, to say, oh, we can do that tomorrow, or we can do it next year. It's not a problem, right? It is a problem, right? Because it backs up and it backs up and it backs up, and then it explodes on you. And that's the big lesson that I hope you learn, because I think in Scotland we've just about caught it in time, right? Because we've been upping our levels of investment really quickly in the last 5 or 7 years. But we are still behind the curve. We are still investing much, much less than I would feel comfortable with. And that makes me worried, right? Because when you get into a world of what says companies are rubbish, right? You're in an adversarial world. And in an adversarial world, you cannot think long-term. You cannot think systemically. You cannot plan for the future. And the only people who suffer from that are the customers and the people who work in the industry, right? And you give the politicians a free ride. So that's your choice, right? Your choice is, do you want to actually leave a legacy that you can be proud of to your kids? Because in Scotland, that's what I'm trying to do. Or do you just be selfish and stick your head in the sand, right? So 3 things. There's a huge challenge. You are going to pay, one way or another, you're going to pay, but just get on with it. That's it. Thanks.